And in the grand scope of a college board, public policy isn't that important, but we still need to cover it. I do think that it's important sort of for you to know there are roughly 100 slides in this PowerPoint, so it will be a fair amount of information, but it's more of a, you can almost say sort of remedial understanding of public policy. We're not going to go into public policy in just really great detail, all right? So we're going to start with this idea of costs and benefits. I would assume this is something that you probably got in economics. I sometimes make assumptions about what you learned in economics, and it was terrible assumptions.
I don't remember.
Well,
You didn't learn about, like,
No.
cost?
The answer is no.
You did.
Yeah, it's just like a vocab term though.
Okay, so if I ask you what opportunity cost is, you know what that means in
yeah.
economic terms.
Yeah, we watched the movie.
You watched the movie on it. Okay, well, whatever. You watched the movie on it. So, sort of similar concept here in terms of government, right? So cost is really just any burden. It can be financial, it can be non-financial, right? Meaning monetary or non-monetary. It can actually be real or perceived. All right, so it's sort of very similar to that economic idea then, right? So your opportunity cost in economics was really anything, all right? Very, very similar concept here in terms of what we look at with government, right? So when you look at the various programs, like a federal child care program that has the cost of taxes, desegregation, or busing specifically, that's a monetary cost in terms of increases in taxes because you got to pay buses to go further, more gas, yada, yada, yada. But there's also sort of the non-monetary idea here of psychological stress. And again, this is real or perceived. Because some people probably have real psychological stress if they're all of a sudden uprooted from their school and moved to another school. Right? For other people, that probably isn't that big of a deal. Right? It sort of depends on your personality. Then a benefit here is any sort of satisfaction. Right? So this is anything you get out of it. And again, this can be monetary or non-monetary. And again, it can be real or perceived. All right? So any advantage you get from any policy go step outside, finish that, come back in. I don't want to make you throw away your breakfast, but you need to stop eating in my class. Alright, so some examples here, right? When we look at our federal child care program, some of the benefits now, lower costs for child care for parents, right? That is a monetary benefit, all right? Busing to achieve desegregation, greater racial harmony, that can be a perceived benefit that may or may not be accurate, and then improvement in opportunity. Again, that's probably only accurate for some students. Right? Specifically, probably the ones getting bused from the bad school to the good school. Alright? Now, there are like 4 different ways that you can sort of look at this, and so we need to understand the different types of costs and the different types of benefits. Alright, so we have what are called widely distributed costs. That's exactly what it sounds like. Alright? That means that pretty much everybody's paying, okay? So income tax, everybody pays it, so long as you have a job. Social security tax, everybody pays it up until like $125,000 or something like that. Once you make more than $125,000, they stop paying the social security tax out. Right? You then have narrowly concentrated costs, okay? These are costs that only affect a smaller subset or a smaller group of people. So again, if you look at what we call a graduated income tax bracket, we understand what that means? Maybe? We'll go over that in a little more detail when we go through taxing. What it means is that different people in the United States pay different tax rates. And so the super wealthy pay a higher tax rate than everybody else. Okay? That is a narrowly concentrated cost. Alright? Then you have widely distributed benefits. These are benefits that everybody gets. So Social Security. Everybody gets Social Security when they hit 70 or whatever the age is now. By the time you guys, if Social Security is still around, by the time y'all are trying to retire, it's going to be like 80. Alright? In part because people live longer and longer, and in part because Social Security is going broke faster and faster. Right? Money for federal highways, right? Widely distributed benefit because everybody can drive on national highways, right? Narrowly concentrated benefits, these are things like farm subsidies, right? We understand that the United States government actually pays people to not grow crops. Did we know that? The United States government pays people to not work, specifically farmers, all right? Why? It's a price manipulation. Okay? If farmers produced everything that they could, it would drive the cost of crops way down, the cost of food way down. Therefore, it would no longer be sustainable for them. They couldn't make a living. It would be very detrimental. So what we do is we pay certain people not to grow in order to decrease supply, which changes. See, now I'm like teaching you economics, which you may or may not have learned at this point. All right. So, those are our sort of ways. Now, that means that we have 4 different types of policies. Okay? And these are basically like vocab type terms now that you need to understand. So, a majoritarian policy sounds fairly self-explanatory, right? Majority. Widely distributed cost, widely distributed benefit. Everybody's involved. Everybody pays, everybody benefits. Easy enough to understand? Alright, so Social Security, that's an example there. And your income tax that goes toward national defense, that's an example. Right? Because obviously we all benefit from national defense. Alright? I don't care necessarily about the analysis. Next, interest group policies. Narrowly concentrated costs, narrowly concentrated benefits, right? So, think about interest groups. They push for one small specific thing that helps them, right? They're the ones paying for it, they're the ones that are getting the benefit for it, all right? Client policies. This is the next. Widely distributed cost, narrowly distributed benefits. Alright, what this means is that with client policies, everybody's paying for it, only a few people are benefiting. And so a good example here is the idea of the farm subsidies, right? We all pay income tax, yes? Well, you don't yet, but you will. And when you start paying income tax, you'll complain about it, right? Like most Americans do. And so what you'll find is that when that money goes to farmers or to some small subset, right, that doesn't really help you. Alright, and I find this is the easiest way for me to do this. Alright, how many of you have taken biology? I would assume most of you, right? So did you guys have to in biology do a little gene, like recessive, so you've seen like a little chart like that, right? So this is basically sort of the way I think about this, right? So when we have wide cost, wide benefit, that was called what? Majoritarian. I can't spell today, apparently. Majoritarian, right? Narrow cost, narrow benefit was interest group. Yeah, apparently I really can't spell. Okay, interest group, right? We now have client policies. Widely distributed cost, narrow benefit, right? So this is client policies. And entrepreneurial policies. And that's why I needed to cut this up, because I really can't spell this word. Entrepreneurial. Alright, so entrepreneurial policies then are these ideas that some sort of policy in which a small subset is going to pay, but now everybody is benefiting. Alright? So, when you look at, and consumer product safety is probably the best example of this, right? So if you have, actually I'll give you an example. Do you know that backup cameras are about to become standard on all automobiles? Did you know that? The United States government is actually going to force auto manufacturers to do that, right? For safety purposes, okay? And that's probably not a bad thing, right? I mean, maybe it is, because maybe now you stare at a video screen instead of actually turning around, and so if something's off the screen, you're not going to see it. But
that's assuming everyone has new cars.
well, yeah, once that happens, right? I mean, once it'll take a decade or more for everyone to have one at that point, right? But it's that sort of same concept with seatbelts, right? So if you actually go out, if you can find a car manufactured before 1963, I think, you don't have to wear a seatbelt in that car. You actually don't have to. Even if there are seatbelts in the car, if you get pulled over and you're not wearing your seatbelt, you can simply explain to the cop, seatbelts were not standard in this automobile, therefore, it actually exists outside of seatbelt laws. Right? But when you look at it, so on entrepreneurial policy there is putting seatbelts in cars. Who benefits? Everybody in the car, right? Everybody who is now buckled into an automobile is safer, right? And who's paying for it? The manufacturer. In reality, you pay for it, right? The manufacturers just increase the cost of the car. But there are issues, or there are times when consumer safety products, they can't increase the cost of the product because people wouldn't pay for it. It's just some sort of regulation, and so they really have no other option. All right. So those are your different policies. Okay. That's all the more detail I want to go into in that. All right. What I want to go into though now is I want to go into taxing and spending, because this is wildly important. Okay. In fact, as far as all public policy goes, this is really the only one I personally really care about. Right. I don't care about defense policy. I don't care about healthcare policy. I'm poor. Right? I'm a lowly teacher. I don't make a lot of money. So for me, I want to know why the government is taking my money, and I want to know why they're spending it, where they're spending it, and why they can't figure out how to balance spending and taxing. All right? So when you look at taxes, one, understand that there are different types of taxes. And one of these types of taxes is called a tariff. What is a tariff? It is a tax on imported goods. Okay, tariffs have to be uniform. What that means is that if you're taxing, if you have a tariff on, I don't care what, automobiles, right? And so you have automobiles that are manufactured in South Korea, like Hyundai and Kia and companies like that. Okay, and they get offloaded in LA or San Francisco. The tariff there has to be the same as the tariff in New York or Boston when BMW is offloading vehicles there. Alright? Does that make sense? Okay. Then there's this idea that direct taxes have to be apportioned to the states based on population. There are actually ways around that. But that is a constitutional provision. Alright? So if we go way back, the tariffs and excise taxes are pretty much the only source of revenue. In fact, when this country was founded, we didn't pay income tax. We didn't pay income tax for nearly a century. Alright? And so the first time that the national government tries to pass an income tax, the Supreme Court actually says that it's unconstitutional. Alright? Which leads to the passing of an amendment, because we talked about this, when you don't like what the court does, what can you do in response? Amend the Constitution. Right? The court says this is unconstitutional and you want it anyways. All you gotta do is amend the Constitution. And we did. And we amended the Constitution to create a national income tax. Alright? Now, taxes make up a very significant percentage of government revenue. Alright? In fact, income tax, that individual income tax is almost 50%, right? Then you have corporate taxes and excise taxes and payroll taxes, and there's all different types of taxes, okay? I want you to understand, corporate taxes down here are pretty low. Republicans want to see them go even lower, right? Republicans would like to see corporations pay zero income tax. Comically, because in this instance, Republicans don't believe that corporations are people. Therefore, they shouldn't have to pay taxes. But there are other times when Republicans want corporations to be people. Just proves that all politicians are inconsistent. But understand that the amount in which you are taxed can dictate other policies, right? And it can dictate results from people. Do we understand that concept? I know that we talked about it at least a little bit in the past. We know that every time you have a child, you get a tax credit. You know that? Right? In fact, you get a tax credit for that child until they're like 17 years old. It is not 18. Because the year they turn 18, technically they're an adult, so you can't get it for that year. So you can only get it up until they're like 17. Or it might even be 16. I don't remember what it is. But we incentivize. The government incentivizes you having children. Right? The government incentivizes you buying a home. When you buy a home, you get a tax credit for purchasing a home. At least right now you do. And so taxes are a means of trying to get people to do things. And so the Republican ideology when it comes to corporate taxes is if you put corporate taxes at zero, what are you trying to do? What? Encourage corporations to stay here. Okay? Because now they don't have to pay taxes. Right? And then that in turn theoretically creates jobs. Okay? So, what we've had over the course of an American lifetime, and this probably doesn't surprise anybody, is we have seen increases and increases in the sort of revolt or the anger or angst or whatever word you want to use amongst people for having to pay income tax. Right? People do not like having to pay income taxes. And so what you end up getting, and this has been relatively true over the last 30 or 40 years now, is you have a massive number of politicians that realize that the easiest way to get a job anymore is to do what? Tax cuts. Right? Vote for me. I'll let you keep more of your money. Yeah, that sounds like a good idea. And so we have massive tax cuts. Right? In fact, Bush 41, so this is the first Bush, right? HW. During the debates in 1988, he actually said that he would not create no new taxes. It was like a famous line. And then he created new taxes. And he didn't have a choice, honestly. As far as like sound economic policy goes, he had to create new taxes. He really did. All right? But in doing so, it was one of the things that led to the rise of Ross Perot, which is ultimately what costs him re-election in 1992. All right? Because Americans are widely opposed to new taxes or having to pay the government more. Okay? Now, what happens is that leads us to a situation where if we're taking in less money, we have to figure out how we're gonna spend it and how we can deal with this issue, right? Prior to Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, because the 1980s is when we start this massive tax cut sort of scheme. Okay? Prior to that point, the debt in the United States of America is under control. We still have a debt, but it is not astronomical. Right? Massive tax decreases, along with increasing non-discretionary spending. And understand, this is a term that you need to know, right? Non-discretionary. That means that Congress does not have any say in this amount of spending. In fact, in 55%, this is no longer accurate. It's actually higher than this now. Right? So before Congress creates its budget, and Congress will create a budget here in a few months, because the fiscal year starts September 1st. So Congress will create a new budget here in a few months, and with that budget, Congress only actually gets to control roughly 35% of spending. The rest of that goes to interest on the national debt, and then non-discretionary spendings or entitlement spending that's already mandated and dictated. Because previous Congresses have said this is what we're going to do. And now the current Congress can't change that. Alright? So, when we look at it, right, we have discretionary spending, and sadly this has now gone up as well. Right? In fact, I want to say the last statistic I saw in national defense, the discretionary spending for national defense is roughly 16% of our budget. Which means that it is roughly half of discretionary spending. Alright? Then we have to pay down our interest. We have other discretionary spending that goes to the states and people like that. Alright? But with all of this, with our spending, the entitlements is what becomes ultimately problematic. Right? Because entitlements are out of control. And they're out of control in part because Social Security has now caught up with us. Right? My parents' generation, who are beginning to retire now, they're a part of what we're called the baby boomers. Right? So, imagine this for a second, if you will. Right? In my mom's family, there were 7 kids. That a big family? For the 1950s, no. It's actually not that big. Okay? In the 1950s, right? I mean, it's big, but it's not like comically large, right? It's not like the Duggars. You don't know who the Duggars are? I'm saying that right, aren't I?
Yeah.
That's that family that has like 30 children.
Oh, and it also is,
20 and counting. I thought they were pushing 30 now.
Well, I'm sure.
oh,
They're a special kind of special, right? But so what happens now is think about this for a second. We now have a baby boomer generation that is beginning to retire. Okay? That means that a significant amount of people are retiring and they're beginning to try to collect Social Security benefits. There's not enough money left for them. Because the people that are currently paying into Social Security cannot cover what the current Social Security payments are. Right? So things like that are getting out of control. The interest on the national debt is getting out of control. Because at this point, we actually don't ever pay down our debt. Ever. Right? Like at no point in time do we ever try to pay down the principal. Instead, all we do is pay interest. Okay? Now, you need to realize, or you need to understand for a minute what that actually means. Alright? Because if we owe, and it's close to, hadn't hit yet, but if we owe $20 trillion, right, that's our debt, $20 trillion, and we're not paying that down, we're only paying the interest, right? Let's just say for the sake of argument, we've got a phenomenal interest rate, 1%. What's 1% of 20 trillion? 200 billion. Right? $200 billion. That means we spend $200 billion just paying off the interest. And then, because we can't balance the budget, we actually take on more debt. Right? And so that means we're now paying interest on more debt. And I'm telling you right now, it ain't 1%. Alright? Think about this for a second. And it's not this bad either, right? Anybody in here have a credit card yet? Anybody? So those of you with your hand up, do you know what your interest rate is on your credit card?
You know what? I don't want to know. Please don't. Oh.
Should I call my mom and apologize?
That's probably your interest rate on your credit card.
That's.
Right now, somebody pull out your little smartphone.
It's not for mom, like for friends. It's gonna be hard.
Whoops, wrong column, wrong spot. That's billion, that's million, that's thousand, that's hundred. Do the math.
Jeez.
Because I can tell you what it comes close to without doing the math.
They already taken all my money.
It comes close to $5 trillion. Now, obviously, the interest rate is not this high either.
Yeah, it's 4.6.
I was gonna say, it's 4 point something. Because if this is 25, then it's 1/4 of this, which is 5 trillion. Right? I'm just rounding there. Okay? Yay! Baker did math. Okay? But so this should give you an idea then about sort of the danger of our national debt. Okay? Now, we'll go through the budget process again. We did this a little bit when we went through Congress and we went through the executive branch, right? But in the executive branch, we have the Office of Management and Budget. So OMB, they create the president's budget, right? They basically create the president's budget the way they want the president wants them to, all right? And in reality, they make all sorts of like weird assumptions to make the numbers work, all right? President reviews it. He then submits it to Congress. Congress will give it to the Congressional Budget Office, which basically checks the OMB's math, and then they realize that it's ridiculous, okay? And Congress comes up with some other sort of option usually. They usually do not just accept the budget from the president as is, right? They're going to modify it in some way. Okay? Then it has significant roles in all three of these committees in the House of Representatives, right? Appropriations, Ways and Means, and Budget. Okay? They're going to get input from agencies and all kinds of people. They need a majority in both houses. And then the Government Accountability Office eventually is going to oversee that this is spent correctly. All right? There are all types of political influences that go into this. All right? All types. The parties obviously have stark differences, right? Republicans every single year, they're like, we need to spend more on defense, right? Whereas Democrats every year, like, we need more entitlements. And they're probably both wrong, but whatever, all right? Interest groups are going to lobby for what they want, for policies that are beneficial to them, for subsidies that are beneficial to them, et cetera, right? This is part of how the whole Iron Triangle plays out. Once it makes it through both houses, the president can sign it or he can veto the entire thing. Remember, no line item veto. So he cannot just be like, hey, I don't like that we're paying for the National Endowments of the Arts. I don't care if kids can play music. Get rid of that. That doesn't work that way. All right? Despite the fact that there are lots of Republican presidents that would love to do that. All right? Just like I'm sure there's Democratic presidents that would be like, no, let's cut the budget for the Department of Defense there a little bit. But can't happen that way. If it is vetoed, Congress can override it with a 2/3 majority in both houses. I'm going to tell you right now, that almost never happens. When it comes to budgeting, almost never, because they can't agree on anything. Right? They really cannot agree on anything. All right? And so here's what happens. Pretty much every year, and it's been every year in your lifetime, your entire lifetime, it's been every year but two in my entire lifetime, we have run a deficit. All right? So deficit, that's sort of a vocab term, that refers to an individual annual budget. You understand that concept? So deficit is annual. every year you run a deficit, that means that you spent more that one individual year than what you took in. When you add up all those deficits over time, that's the national debt. That's how we get to $20 trillion. All right? So that's the sort of concept behind this. All right? And again, it's the 1980s that really starts this. All right? So for all of you that are in here that are like diehard Republicans, I know you are, right? Because Republicans will run around until the cows come home talking about Ronald Reagan, the greatest president ever. Ronald Reagan's fault. Right? This happened on Reagan's watch. All right? In fact, Congress couldn't even pass a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution because they can't balance the budget in the first place. And one of the things we get out of all of these conflicts, and this probably doesn't surprise you, is we get government shutdowns. Right? Now here's the ridiculous thing, this is what you really need to understand about a government shutdown. Because it happened, what, like 2.5 years ago? Something like that now? And I don't remember exactly how long ago it happened. Right? But like 2.5 years ago, Republicans in Congress shut the government down because they didn't like the budget that the Democrats were trying to get through. They wanted their own thing that they knew Obama would veto, right? And so when they shut the government down, what happens to the little park ranger who works at whatever national park? He goes home and he doesn't have a job for 2 weeks or however long, right? When the government ceases to be shut down 2 weeks later, what happens to him? He goes back to work, okay? Now, he just got himself a 2-week unpaid vacation, right? When the government shuts down, what do you think happens to Congress? What?
They still get paid.
Yeah, they still get paid. So do they give back any of their $186,000 a year salary? No. But do we take salary from the poor little park ranger who makes $35,000 a year?
Yeah.
Yes. All right. So here are some statistics for you. And these are current. I actually went and looked these up this morning. Right? So there's our national debt as of right now, $19.8 trillion. Yeah, not, should have gotten rid of that 6. Meant to delete that 6. Didn't delete the 6 apparently. Yeah. And so, almost $20 trillion. There's our population. That means that each citizen, to include my 18-month-old daughter, right? If we do this, basically owes $60,000. How many of you have $60,000 laying around? Because if you do, I would like to be adopted. No? All right. And our debt increases by over $2 billion a day. Daily. $2 billion daily. Okay? That means that in a matter of a month, right, it's actually pushing about $75 billion in a month.
So, how do you think it would go down, or is it just going to stay there forever?
Honestly, at this point, I don't believe that it can be paid down anymore. I don't. All right? Because, one, congressmen just don't care. All right? Now, I do want you to understand this, because this is the one thing that people will make an argument of. Do we know what GDP is? Did we learn that in economics? Somebody say barely. All right.
I know what it stands for. There's something.
GDP. So, GDP is gross domestic product. Okay? Gross domestic product. Now, gross domestic product is how much basically the government is making annually, or how much the country really is making annually. There are a large number of people, and I'm talking about people that are smarter than I am, that have a PhD in economics from like Harvard, who wholeheartedly believe that so long as your debt does not exceed your GDP, you're good. I don't believe that. And we are approaching the point where debt is going to exceed GDP. Okay? Because Trump runs around talking about China artificially inflating its numbers. So does the United States. gonna stop there for today. I've got a little bit of time. What I want to do is I want to show you